Hey there, everybody. I am thrilled today to be talking to Amy Z, the SLP. And welcome to the show, Amy. Will you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Amy, and I'm a speech therapist. I've been practicing for 8 years, and I actually took a year off from being an SLP, but I won't bore you guys with the details. I do have a pretty diverse background, but right now, I have my own private practice. It's just me. I like it that way, and I have been working with a pediatric population for about 2.5 years now. And I have the opportunity to specialize in supporting autistic children and their families.
That's awesome. I didn't realize until this moment that you had a private practice. So that is so exciting. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been incredible. I love that I can just have these really intimate relationships with my families, and we're very close. So it's been a dream.
Yeah. That has to be. I know that I was in the public schools for 25 years, but earlier in my career, you know how a lot of us do little side gigs to try to supplement at least school income. And so I was able to work kind of a couple nights a week in a private clinic, not my own, but it was really nice to just be laid back and get to really know the parents. And that's just got to be really fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's dive in. We're going to be talking today about Gestalt language processing. And can you explain what Gestalt language processing is and how it differs from analytic language processing in children's language development?
Yeah, so when we refer to Gestalt language processing, we're thinking about how an individual is first beginning to develop language by repeating language that they hear in the exact same way they heard it. So they could be hearing it from their communication partners, they can be hearing it from media, and this is referred to as delayed echolalia. So instead of learning single units of language at a time, like analytic language processors, Gestalt language processors assign meaning to an entire chunk of language, and you probably have often heard them referred to as gestalts. And gestalts are these intonationally defined chunks of language, and typically they are attached to a very emotionally like charged experience. Like it is such a deep meaning, and that's what these individuals end up latching onto. And so, for example, I have the sweetest little boy that I get to work with, and one of his gestalts is, "You want to go to the bathroom?" And when he first said that to me, I was like, "Oh my gosh, of course." So I like run out, and this was one of the first times I saw him, so it was still a new space, and his mom just smiled at me with like the kindest eyes and was like, "Oh, that's so sweet, but like we just went. He actually uses that when he wants to leave." So I was like, "Okay." So he's attached this whole meaning of like, do you want to go to the bathroom of anytime he really doesn't want to do something or he wants to leave. And so Gestalt language processors don't yet recognize that they can take those individual words out of that chunk of language or script and use them individually to make up new language yet, right? So they work through this framework that I won't get too bogged down in details, but I know Marge Blanc has made that natural language acquisition framework. And essentially what we're doing is equipping these kids with a lot of different scripts with different communication functions that can eventually be broken down to work towards that self-generated language. Whereas analytic language processors can start off by learning those single words. And if we're taking that, like you want to go to the bathroom example, instead of learning it in that chunk, maybe the child learns it by saying go and then go bathroom and then I go bathroom. So we're doing this like word plus word plus word, and that they're kind of doing the opposite where GLPs are, starting off with that whole chunk and then they're slowly starting to break those things down.
Yeah, I think what you're saying makes so much sense because I think everybody listening has probably by now in their head gone, oh, yeah, this student or that client or this student or my child does exactly this and can think of their own gestalts, which, you know, if you think of echolalia, delayed echolalia, scripting, words we've heard, if you're using those words for a child, that probably means they're a Gestalt language processor. You know, a lot of those
Mhm.
terms kind of come together. And I think in particular, I had a post the other day because a mom had messaged, or she had posted it on her Facebook, a mom that I'm friends with, and she had her son went in and he typed in his device this entire phrase. And it was, I don't remember it exactly, but it was from the movie Up. And it was this big long phrase about Paradise Falls and sending a postcard. And I think they figured out really quickly what it was because they know his movies inside and out and could see what he was writing. But this is the same kid that I was scolded by a fellow SLP a couple years ago when I had met with parents in the summer before he moved on to kindergarten. And I recommended that they go through a company and try to get an AAC device for him because I knew he had so much more in his brain than he could get out and show people. And there were just little indicators, like really liking letters and kind of starting to spell, those kind of things. Well, the SLP at the school he ended up going to called in the fall, called me and was like, why did you suggest that they get this? He is not ready for it, da 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 da, all these things. And I'm just sitting there like shocked. I can't even remember what I said. But later that year, his mom posted on Facebook, oh my gosh, look at this. He spelled out on his device zones of regulation. Another time he was you know, took his device out for the very first time in the car and he was pressing a button and it was saying bowling alley, bowling alley. And she was like, well, Bud, we've never been to a bowling alley. What do you want with a bowling alley? But she couldn't see because he was in the back seat in his car seat. So they got home. She went and looked, and the picture was of McDonald's. It was just labeled incorrectly. So it was saying
Oh.
bowling alley, but he was asking for McDonald's. And she's like, "Oh, Bud, we're going right now." So I think a lot of this I tell you this because presuming competence, I feel, is so important, especially with Gestalt language processors, where you're like, they aren't telling me like juice, hungry, cracker, anything like that,
Mhm.
but they can sing an entire song and they can say
Right.
the words that are needed. So that's where I think it can be confusing and people think, well, it's just nonsense or jargon or not meaningful, but it really is meaningful.
Yeah, and oh my gosh, I love that story. I did see that on Instagram. I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is so cute." And I had a client who did something very similar where she came in with her talker and I would say she's a part-time AAC user. There are days that she really doesn't use it because she feels more well-regulated, and then there are days that she needs it more. And so one day I was talking with her grandma and I was telling her how my daughter had just turned 1 and my client, we came in and we were just kind of like walking around the room and, I was following her lead. And out of nowhere, she just started to type. And oh my gosh, I wish I remembered exactly what it was, but it was something like, um, Miss Amy sing baby happy birthday. Like she wanted to sing happy birthday for my daughter in the session. And I thought, I like almost cried. I was like, of course we can sing happy
Oh
birthday.
my gosh, that's
Um,
amazing.
yes, but absolutely. We need to give access to AAC to these kids because if we don't know what they can do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we're
Yeah.
going to talk a little bit more about like the programming piece or just things to think about with AAC
Hmm.
with kids that are GLPs. But what indicators are there that you can kind of, I don't know, get some indicators that a child is a Gestalt language processor?
Yeah. So I know I talked about it before, right? So if your child is using delayed echolalia, so if they have a lot of scripts or they're using a lot of rich intonation, that usually signals to me they're likely a GLP. Um, and the one thing I would like to add is that the scripts that they're using don't necessarily always have to be these scripts from movies or like things that seem out of context, right? Like that example of that little boy I talked about. Do you want to go to the bathroom? Is quote unquote like functional, like typical language, but that is very much a script that he
Yeah.
has learned and he's attached to meaning. So using a lot of scripts, rich intonation, um, their speech may be very difficult to understand. And so it may even sound like jargon.
Mm,
But if we listen closely, you may hear like the same intonation every time. And so that's where some detective work comes in when we're working with families, if especially because they usually know what their kids are watching. So I've had some success when families are like, "Oh, it's from this movie or it's from Daniel Tiger." So that's been really cool to see when you like get that aha moment with that
Yes.
kind of jargon that you hear. Um, your child may be a GLP if they have some trouble with answering questions.
Mm.
So you may actually hear them repeat the questions back because that's their way of either processing what you said, maybe taking a conversational turn, but they're not able to yet answer fully because they don't understand like what all those individual words mean yet, right? And so
Yeah.
as as they work through their stages and they start to break down those scripts, you'll see an increase in ability to respond to those questions or answer them. So that's something I see. You may hear your client or your child speaking in third person or referring to themselves by name, or using some of those, pronoun errors. And it's really just because they're repeating it the same way they heard it. It's not
Hmm.
necessarily because they know about the rules of pronouns yet. And the most common example I see and I hear is when kids will say, "You did it," after they did something. And it's because, an adult has cheered them on and said, "You did it." So they're holding on to that meaning and that's what they're repeating. If a child is non-speaking, you may notice that they're very musically inclined. They really love music. Or something I see a lot, they may study or often replay certain media clips like like over and over, and there sometimes the kids communicate through videos, um and that's really cool. I haven't had an AAC user yet who does that, but I have heard really cool stories about it. And there's also times parents have shared with me their kids are just stimming on the videos, and that's also okay. But I,
Yeah.
I tend to see these like a combination of these things, whether they're speaking or non-speaking, that kind of signal to me, okay, like I want to keep this in the back of my mind.
Yeah, goodness, that the descriptor of listening to a clip over and over again or watching it over and over and over and over, it's really, really relatable because I've seen so many kids with so many different movies that do that over and over again. And I even had a former student that I had when he was K through 2, and I went out to visit them. And as an adult in his 20s, he didn't have an AAC device. And so I was kind of consulting with them to try to set them on the path to get one for him in his 20s. And he normally, when I got there, he'd be walking around with his headphones and his iPad, and he would be watching, I can't remember which movie, but it was like a Disney movie, this certain part over and over and over. So even into adulthood, for some of our past students, that can be something they really love. So when you're programming an AAC device for GLP, what are some considerations or modifications or things that might differ from traditional programming?
Okay. I love this question. Okay. Oh my gosh, I feel like I could talk about this all day. And so before I talk about like the actual programming, I want to start off with, the feature matching process and just like getting started, right? When I'm going through this AAC assessment process with families, what are things that I'm thinking about? And so the very first thing I want to say, because this is a question that I get asked a lot, there is no such thing as there being an AAC system that's better for GLPs.
Mm,
Okay. I the AAC system is not what's going to be what allows for an AAC user to be successful. It's really how we use it and how we teach them to use it. I have worked with suspected GLPs, kids that I know are GLPs on different programs, and they've been successful regardless of what it is. So I just want to share that because I find that sometimes SLPs or families almost feel a little badly because they're like, I don't have touch chat and we have this, and did I make the wrong choice? And so I hope that people who are listening feel comforted by this and know
yeah.
that you can absolutely be successful with anything. Um, and I share that because, I did have a call actually recently with a parent who wanted to do some parent coaching because his son had Prolo Quote to Go for a couple of years. And then they recently switched providers, and their provider said, "Oh, actually, touch chat is better with like for GLPs." And so, as parents, they want to do whatever they need to for their child. And so dad shared, we ended up changing, but now I feel overwhelmed because I don't know how to model for my son anymore. So I share the story, not from a place of wanting to shame anybody, but really from a place of wanting to encourage professionals to really be mindful about what we say to families and just,
Mhm.
know that what we recommend and how those recommendations impact the AAC user and the families.
Yeah, I love that because I see in my Facebook community all the time people asking like, what AAC app should I get? And there's always a million different recommendations. So I think that advice, Amy, is super great. Like, take the burden off yourself. Don't feel bad or shameful for what you picked. There's a way to make any of them work.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, with that being said, there are features I do consider when going through the feature matching process. I'm going to have like a lot of like caveats for these things, but I always like to talk about nuance because nothing is black and white.
Mhm.
But when I do have a kiddo in front of me, I work with pediatric population. But when I have a child in front of me and I suspect that they are a GLP, some features that I may think about are, does this AAC application have the ability to record original audio?
Mm.
Does this application have the ability to embed video clips or link to YouTube or an app like Netflix? Does it have a visual scene display? Is there a keyboard? Most robust systems do have a keyboard. If there's a whiteboard feature, things like that, right? But I want to point out that I think it's really important to understand that these are features I very much take into consideration, but you're not going to know whether or not these features are really successful for your client until they're actually implemented. I had a mom. She's so sweet. She was a big advocate for her son. She was like, I'm just gonna get the AAC device myself because I'm not gonna wait for insurance. I'm not gonna wait for like a waiting list for an AAC assessment because at the time I didn't do them, so I was gonna refer her out. She's like, no, I'm just gonna do it myself. I was like, okay, that's fine. And parents who are listening, like that is okay to do that if you are not feeling like you have access to these supports, right? Like get started if you feel like that's kind of the only choice that you have. But she did this and she loved touch chat. She loved all the features that I was talking about, but we embedded video clips and she thought it was going to be wonderful for her son. And after about a month of implementation, mom she came to me and she said, "I actually really don't like this because it's causing more aggression, more frustration and dysregulation at home."
Mm.
So I think what's really important is we have these features we can think about, but we really need to think about like everything outside of just the fact that this child is a GLP. What does the family life look like? What is the dynamic? What does their day to day look like? And during the assessment process, are there other pieces that might be more important? Sometimes in my head, I have a client in front of me and I'm like, okay, I think they would really respond well to um, LAMP, for example, because of XYZ. Or I've had parents who've said, oh, I kind of like the way LAMP is organized, but then the AAC user doesn't want LAMP. So just because I have a plan in my head, if the AAC user can tell me when I'm giving them choices that they don't want LAMP and they're picking touch chat or Prolo Code to go, that is going to be what matters most. So that's another thing to think about too. So just
Yeah.
know that there is no best system. There are features we think about, but we're not going to know how they land for each child until we use them. And sometimes we don't need to use all of those, and that's okay too. We don't need to, right?
Yeah, that's such a great
Yeah.
point, and something that, really looking at how they're responding to it, either during the assessment period or even when it's okay to change things up when you're navigating that initial time after you've implemented it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of programming, I love this question too. And again, this is so individualized and very specific to each AAC system. So I'm not going to be able to really like tell you everything there is about every application. But when I think about programming and modifications, I actually think about how can I use what's already available inside of the application and how can I actually avoid having to program so much? And I say this for a really big reason. I'm always thinking about the caregivers. Always.
Mm,
They are my first priority. And when we are asking them to program so much, modify so much, we are increasing a cognitive load for them. And we need to, again, be mindful of the fact that they have other things that are going on, right? Speech and our sessions, like sometimes I think it's so easy to get lost in our world and like, well, of course you have to do this and that. But we parents, some of them don't have time. That's the
mhm,
reality. And I want parents to understand and know that you're a good parent if you can do all these programming, and you're also still a great parent if you're using what's available in the system. So, like for example, I'm gonna name just like some of those more commonly known apps like Proloquo to Go, TouchChat, TD Snap. A lot of them have pre-stored messages already that I think lend themselves beautifully in supporting GLPs. And if you're listening and you're like, what the heck are pre-stored messages? Those messages are already pre-programmed within an AAC system. So they are typically phrase-based or sentence-based. Okay. So for example, Proloquo to Go, I know has a negative folder. I wish they would rename it to maybe like self-advocacy or protesting, because that's really
yeah,
what they're going for with that. But
totally.
inside, but inside of that folder, there are, I was just looking at it before to make sure I had an example, but they had things like not that, not this, not again. So we are fulfilling some of these things we think about when we want to offer potential language models for our GLPs. We're offering them a communicative function of being able to protest, but even within that system, it's showing us how we can, kind of mix and match that chunk of not with other words. So we're kind of going through the stages naturally in the system. And then when people ask, well, I don't know how to program for stage 3, 4, 5, 6, at that point, we're able to just use the system as it is, right? There are single words. There's a way to use those advanced grammatical markers already in there. So, like, we do not need to be programming all of this stuff. And for people listening, I'm not saying we are never customizing, right? Because there is importance to customizing too. I typically, like my rule of thumb is let's start customizing some of those fringe vocabulary. What are those specific things that are really unique to your child that are really meaningful? And can we do that and start off with using the pre-stored messages? I will add gestalts if a parent is telling me, they really say this every single time. And so I'll add the gestalt to the system and I will organize it based on how it's organized. So if it's, Proloquo to Go, right, like my child before that I was talking about who says, you want to go to the bathroom?
Yeah.
Like I might put that in the negative folder for him to self-advocate, right? That's where I'm going to program it. But we really can have so much success without having to always think about like this idea that we have to program so much. And
Yeah.
like it just is true. I remember I have a little boy and he is like I'll never forget any of my clients. But
Yeah.
I think I remember him so clearly because he came to me only being able to have, I think he was only able to say like ba and pa. And so I recommended an AAC evaluation. They recommended LAMP. And this was a case where I really thought about family dynamic. Mom just had a baby. They were going through like job changes. They're balancing him, they're like in the midst of like suing the school. Like there's so much outside of speech that's going on. We didn't program anything. And this little boy moved beautifully. He used it so well. And he got to a point where he was actually able to stop using his device
Wow.
because he actually ended up acquiring, the verbal speech and parents. But that's just a story that I share with people because I'm like, we can do it. It's like things are possible. And it's really just about how are we teaching them? How are we using the tool?
Yeah. That's also really valuable because I especially love when you talked about taking that pressure and that burden off of parents and caregivers. Because over 25 years, I've seen lots of different families and lots of different situations. And, sometimes in the schools, I would have a negative comment from maybe a paraprofessional or just another team member. That they would say, well, this parent's not doing this or that. And it's like everyone's doing the best they can. And he doesn't have to have them being on top of this to be successful. And it's okay. We need to just meet caregivers where they're at and respect that there's a lot going on, a lot of pressures and things outside of our speech session or our special education um, classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm like, that is truly what drives almost all of the decisions that I make with my clients. Like, how is family going to feel about this? Do they feel
Mhm.
comfortable? Do we feel overwhelmed? What can we change? That is such an important piece that I find sometimes can be missing when we're really thinking about it. And a friend of mine, we were having a discussion, and a child being a GLP is just one part of who they are. We need
Mhm.
to think of the whole big picture.
Yeah, great point. So when we're taking then that AAC that they're using and starting to integrate it to support kids or integrate it in the classroom or at home, are there any things different we would do for a GLP, or would it be? I know we've heard so much more probably in the last 5 years about modeling without expectation. And I think that that is a piece, learning more and more about that, even for me as an SLP, has been so freeing. And I think it takes the pressure off of a lot of people. So maybe talk a little bit about that, and then if there's anything else you can think of.
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, I think whether a child is a GLP or not, I think the most effective thing that we can do is creating really meaningful opportunities, because we know that when given repeated exposure, they're going to learn symbols in contexts that are meaningful for them, right? Like, um, I always give this example to parents because they'll tell me like, oh, I don't know, I think this is a lot of buttons. This might be overwhelming for them, and they don't feel overwhelmed as the parents. They just feel like it's too hard for their child, and I'll ask them, do they enjoy, going to Starbucks, or they'll tell me like, oh my gosh, like they can't see the M for McDonald's because they know what that means. And I'm like, well, this
Yes.
is a symbol that they've learned repeatedly because it is something they really care about.
Yeah.
So I think that it's so important to make sure that when we're teaching how to use an AAC, that it's really embedded in contexts that are meaningful. And I know that a lot of really good intention communication partners like want to teach by testing, or like show me where this is, or
Mm.
tell me on your talker. Like, they're not honoring all forms of communication, right? Like whether they're gesturing or maybe they're saying their verbal, like using their verbal speech. But like when we can teach in a way that is meaningful and without all of this pressure, we show them that communication can be really fun.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what we want to do.
And that connection that you build is everything. And I think I heard, I think it was Serena from PlaySpark. She had an Instagram reel up once that said, basically, like, go out of that teacher mode where we're question, question, question. And we just do it. It's like, intuitive or not intuitive, but like natural. That's just what we
Mhm.
all default to. Like, what color is it? What's this? Let's put it on
Right.
and under. And she said, try to take a session or a time when you're working with a child and take like 10 minutes and don't question at all and see how hard it is because we don't even realize we're doing it. And when you do that, you naturally find yourself instead like modeling or narrating because I did it. I did this challenge myself and it was like, holy smokes, all the things that I caught myself was gonna say that I had to stop. Oh my gosh. But I felt like I was more than in the activity alongside or with the child than
Mhm.
directing it. And so I just implore everybody to try that 10-minute challenge on yourself and see what you learn from it because we don't realize the amount of questions we ask.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And that is something that above all else, the first thing that I focus on, whether I'm in an evaluation, whether I'm in treatment, I focus on creating safety and building a relationship with the child. Because without safety, without that trust, we have nothing, right? So regardless of whether or not I have a GLP or not in front of me, we need that. And I don't know if you've ever heard of her. Her name is Erin Forward. I love her so much. She's an SLP, also, and she's like does a lot of stuff on trauma informed like practices and feeding therapy. But one of the things that I learned from her that I loved, like on a biological level, like relationship is the fastest or one of the fastest ways that we can move from our amygdala into our frontal lobe. So people who are
Mm,
listening and are like, what the heck is my amygdala? That's basically like when we are so dysregulated, we're operating from this like intense emotion. It's very hard for us to like kind of come back, right?
mhm.
So relationship that we build with our clients and the ability to co-regulate with them is above all else because and that can look different for everybody, right? I'm thinking about some clients that I started with who needed more time to feel safe. I have a little boy who comes into my room and he bangs on the shelves because he's trying to self-regulate after a long day. And so
Mhm.
I can read his body language and sometimes he doesn't want me to be close to him. Like, but he allows me to model on his AAC device and he will immediately run over to me smiling because he's very interested, right? Like that is safety for him. Safety
Yeah.
can be a child knowing that their scripting and delayed echolalia is going to be honored, right? Safety and relationship is like always, always number one.
Wow. I have a membership, and in my membership, I teach first we have to have regulation and connection. And kind of first it's regulation, but because if you're dysregulated, it's even sometimes hard to build a connection, but they're very closely tied in this, like these foundational pieces. And it's okay to give yourself permission to just take time to build that connection. I tell people at the beginning of the school year, when you're in the classroom, whether you're a SLP or a special ed teacher or paraprofessional, like give yourself that time because the rest will follow. The teaching and the learning and the things we think of as the goals that they're working on, that will follow. But if you don't build that connection first and really get to know what they love, you might find out things like, oh my gosh, this student loves cocoa melon, but we find transition to like a work area is difficult. Well, what if we always started our time with them with cocoa melon? And then you can kind of like integrate some other things in
Hmm.
but it all starts with that connection and knowing what they're passionate about.
Yeah. And even maintaining that, right? Like we're not just creating
Yeah.
relationship to get you to do something.
Yeah.
Like this is an ongoing thing. And
Yeah.
that is so important, like for all kids, but in terms of AAC users, like I want them to know that I'm a safe space for them. I want them to know, like I want them to want to communicate with me.
Mhm.
And I need to make sure that they feel safe enough and comfortable to do that.
And I feel like sometimes that even includes thing within a day, just one day or one session. It can be up and down like that, where you have to revisit connection. So
Hmm.
let's say I have a student and I'm working with them on something and they're protesting, pushing it away. The idea of honoring that protest instead of going power struggle, he has to do this or he's going to learn that he can get out of anything he wants. When you hear that kind of thinking, I like to challenge that and say, okay, instead of getting in a power struggle, which is going to wreck your relationship, at least momentarily, can we shift into something else, give time, give some choices, and go to something that's going to build our relationship back up? And then eventually we can get back, whether it's the next day or the next week or the next month, back
Hmm.
to some of those things that were on your agenda, but not
Right.
necessarily interesting for them.
Yeah.
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 So, what strategies do you recommend? Is there anything you can think of when it comes to AAC, like using AAC with or without, just strategies to support Gestalt language processors in general?
Yeah, I think so. I think having access to AAC can be helpful for these kids, especially whether they're speaking or non-speaking, right? I have some kids, for example, who script a lot, but when they have access to like a keyboard or something else, they can actually communicate a lot more than what they're able to verbalize.
Yeah.
So I think just like having access to that is really important. I think strategies for me, like when I'm modeling, so I tell people, and I think I think sometimes or a lot of times people want me to give them like a straight answer. And a lot of times I'm like, well, this is really specific to every client, but I want everyone to know there's no like wrong or right way to model as long as that connection piece is there and we're focusing on that. But some things that I think about when I'm modeling for GLPs, right? I've done it a couple of different ways. So if I have, I remember working with a little girl who loved Miss Rachel, like loved, loved,
Mhm.
loved Miss Rachel so much. And so when I was modeling on her AAC device, I would do a couple of different things. So I would sing that song with her out loud, but then I might push one of the core words that were in the song that she was singing, right? So
Yeah.
uh, I think she was saying like, put it in, put it in, put it in. So every time we had the word in come up, I would press the word in,
Yeah.
but I would still sing with her. Or I may add two of those core words, like put in, while I'm still singing verbally. Or sometimes I don't sing anything, and then I just activate like certain buttons on the device with them because sometimes some kids like just benefit from like less input, I find, where it's almost a little too overstimulating when I'm doing everything.
Mhm.
But those are some things that I do that I have found to be successful. Again, kind of tying back to what can I use in the system that's already there without having to like adjust or modify or change things too much.
Yeah.
Um, I think offering a lot of like wait time, pauses, and just reading their body language too is so important, I think, because people always will ask, my child is not engaged with the AAC, they're not using it, they're stimming on it, all these things. But if we really are paying attention and we're being really good communication partners and reading these subtle cues, I will know that the things that I'm modeling or sharing have kind of, quote unquote, landed. If,
Mhm.
for example, maybe they're carrying out like some action related to the button that I've pushed on the AAC. I
Yeah.
can tell that it's landed if like they're looking at it and they're really kind of going back and forth between the AAC device and the thing that we're talking about. I can see if it's landed if they maybe have not a desire, quote unquote, desired response. Maybe they are upset because they don't want that. Like they are showing me that they are understanding. So I really encourage just a lot of wait time, a lot of pause, silence, like really be with them and read some of those nonverbal cues that you might be missing.
That's perfect. And I love the idea about singing the songs that they like and then modeling a word.
Hmm.
That's a super easy place to start, I think, in the classroom. And that might actually be a piece of the answer to my last question for you. How can SLPs collaborate with special education teachers? Because a lot of times, as SLPs, you might see the child for 20 minutes at twice a week or whatever it is, and then they're in the special education classroom all day long.
Hmm.
And we don't want to overwhelm the special educators. They have
Right.
how many students with different devices? And so, like, how can they support, I guess, any child who is using AAC in those beginning stages?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing is obviously, and I want to say this, preface this by saying I have not worked in a school system. So if I'm
Yeah.
sharing anything that you are like, that might not be ideal, you can, totally call me out on that. So I try to be, but I also understand and recognize that everybody has so much that they're doing. So the first thing I would say is, if we have a child who's using a device, the SLP, I think it would behoove them to probably do at least some education just in terms of best practices on AAC, right?
Mhm.
I just had this with one of my clients. recommended mom pursue like an independent AAC evaluation. An outside evaluator came in to evaluate her daughter. And the very first thing that the evaluator shared with me was the implementation of the AAC is what's the problem. And like we haven't even touched like programming, modeling, like the implementation itself, right?
Yeah.
So I would say making sure that we remember that the AAC device has to be available. Like access is important. If we don't have the AAC device available, how are we going to use it? So
Yeah.
teaching them the importance of access, teaching them the importance of making sure that it's charged and available for the student, teaching them that we want to model instead of quiz, right? Doing a lot of heavy prompting,
Yeah.
avoiding any kind of physical prompting like hand over hand. I'm just thinking about this little girl
Yeah.
that, or I shouldn't say she's little, but this girl that I'm working with, and these are all the things that were happening. And it created this like prompt dependence where she wasn't initiating her talk, like using her talker at all. And
Mhm.
so I think even just before talking about modeling, like what are the things that we need to have in place before we can even start giving them kind of like, I don't want to say homework, but like ideas of what they can model for the child.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Absolutely. And what you just said made me think of all my years in the classroom. And I can even vouch for in the morning, you're transitioning kids from the bus or from their car, and you have a classroom full of kids. And things get so busy and so many things happen during that transition because transitions are like the number one hardest part of the day. And the transition in from a different location, like the bus, is super challenging and day to day, you just don't know how it's going to go. So I have even had days. I'm the SLP and I've had days where I've forgotten to grab the device out of the backpack. You get in the classroom, things get going, and then like you're 45 minutes in and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot to grab this. So I'm glad that you took it back that far. Like, grab it and bring it in. Just make sure it's in there and charged, right? And
yeah,
then from there, you can work on teaching about modeling. And I think one of the biggest things to teach with modeling is that you don't have to model full sentence. And so you
yeah,
yourself don't have to go in and put a full sentence together. Like, and this might have to come from the SLP and special education teacher, but maybe that's helpful where people have in a classroom a word of the week, or you could say,
mhm,
during these winter activities, we're going to focus on these couple words, and then maybe give each paraprofessional a little time to explore the device themselves to kind of feel like they can locate what they need. And I think those kind of really oh, I don't even know how to describe it, but just like simple trainings. It doesn't have to be
yes,
big, huge 2 hour AAC training. Like these micro trainings would probably
yes.
be best in a classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as they're going through those core words of the week, if we know a child is scripting and they're using more of that delayed echolalia, our verbal models can match that.
Mm,
So we're still giving them that like phrase-based kinds of input or sentences, right, to expand those communication functions by giving them that verbal model.
yeah,
And then we're still also activating the words on the AAC system. I may say, like, to take it a step further when they're ready, I think it would be worthwhile for the SLP to even show them things like the pre-stored messages, like I know, for example, touch chat has a really nice predictive text feature, and I show families, oh, you can actually push this, and like there's a button in there somewhere that says it's time to, and when you push it, it brings you back to the home page, and you can actually do like it's time to go, or it's time to play, it's time to eat. Like that is, you're not looking for all those little individual words, but
yeah.
we have that pre-stored message there, and it makes it much more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. With you talking about that, it just made me think of something that I think last month one of my members told me. She said that they have this activity that they do every once in a while when they have a staff meeting with just their
Hmm.
paraprofessionals or OT, their like immediate staff. They will take like 10 minutes and each of them they must have several classroom AAC devices, but each person has one and they can only communicate with each other using those for those 10 minutes. Wouldn't that be like a fun thing to do, but also a learning experience of like,
Yeah.
man, to navigate it and find the things you need and,
Hmm.
kind of looking at it from the user's end, but also
Right.
when you're trying to figure out what to say to other people, you're going to see like that's why you need some wait time. That's
Yeah.
why um, you can kind of empathize with how difficult it can be when you're starting to learn, that kind of
Hmm.
thing. Isn't
Yeah,
that a cool
absolutely.
idea? Like,
That is a great idea. I think
yeah,
that would be so much fun.
I know, I know. And it would just add a little bit of humor too, because, pe some people, not only feeling empathy for some of the frustration, but the humor as adults with each other, just kind of going like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that this and this and this were part of the AAC device, or didn't know it would be this difficult.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, absolutely.
well, Amy, thank you so much for being here. Is there any specific best place to find you, or where can people find all your things?
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for having me. I love chatting about this. You can find me on Instagram. I'm at amyz.theslp. And my website is there too if anybody has any like questions that they want to ask. Probably would be a better idea to get my contact information from the website because my DMs just kind of disappear
Yeah,
sometimes.
yeah, they probably get full. And you guys, her Instagram is full of videos of real examples, things that you're going to be able to relate to and see. So definitely go follow Amy and start learning from her video examples because she's a great place to learn. All right. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much.